Welcome to Haggy Reads For You on Wolf Spirit Radio. Colleen, Haggy, reads children's stories for the wee ones up to the teens. She also reads books for grown-ups. Tune in, kick back, relax, and listen in. You're listening to Wolf Spirit Radio.
Hi everyone, it's Colleen, and it is Wednesday, December 2nd, 2015, and it's time for Haggy Reads For You. And today I'm going to pick up where I left off last week with the Zephyrus Archives, Mission of Eternity. This is part 8. And this book was written by T.J. Glenn. As the three laggards approached the group, they ascertained the nature of the discussion. It had nothing to do with philosophy or healing. Everyone had gathered around the 5 healing tables, but the discussion revolved around the tables themselves, and how to move them from location to location. Logistics are a Roman specialty, Pontius told Yeshua. We can get your tables wherever you want them, along with the tents and anything else you'd like. Outside of town, it wouldn't pose much of a problem, added Roshaya, because we could use carts. Jerusalem is so peculiar, said Pontius, and so different from Roman cities. In Jerusalem, you can't walk for a quarter hour in any direction without having to go uphill or downhill, and the streets become stairs. Stairway streets. A Roman engineer's nightmare for sure, Joseph added. And yet we're able to move the goods around without carts. A hung-over and subdued Lazarus grumbled. It wasn't exactly loads of fun carrying these 5 tables over here to the palace first thing in the morning. Mary play-acted a sigh of distress. Now that Passover is finished, Simon and the others are already on their way to Caesarea. I never thought I'd miss the functionary followers. I wouldn't go that far, Lazarus muttered. We can provide the labor, offered Pontius, but there must be a simpler solution. He asked Yeshua, when and where would you like to do your first public healing session? 3 days from now, answered Yeshua. There are suitable places in the Mount of Olives area. A good choice of location, exclaimed Joseph. Pontius told Yeshua, and that gives us ample time to construct new tables for you, so you don't have to keep lugging these around. Joseph's enthusiasm noticeably increased. I have a workshop and storage facility in the new city, not far from the Mount of Olives, and I have the perfect fabric for the tabletops in my inventory. Martha made a show of examining one of the flowing sleeves of Humilia's robe. You apparently have lots of perfect things in your inventory, Joseph. Joseph gave Martha a silly grin. But of course. How are we supposed to know about all these perfect goods? Asked Martha. You never seem to make a show of what you have. Joseph's grin shifted into an amusing smirk. I'm not so insecure as to need people to admire my inventory. His comment sparked a wave of comic relief throughout the group. Joseph bowed to Martha. But for you and yours, a special invitation is hereby extended. You may examine most of my inventory, but not all. I have things I wouldn't want any other human being to know about. That is, until a rare opportunity arose to sell any of those particular items. Apparently those items would sell for a lot, observed Pontius. A wave of preternatural realization washed over Joseph, and his eyes appeared to focus on things not physically present. He glanced up at Yeshua, and then back at Pontius. My merchant's instincts are telling me you may be such a customer someday, Pontius. Whatever you need done, I can provide the hard goods to accomplish the task. But that's a long way down the road, Yeshua interjected as he stepped over to Pontius. For now, we'll address the matters at hand, like your back, Pontius. How does it feel? It feels as perfect as any of Joseph's inventory, replied Pontius, allowing Yeshua to help situate him on the center table. In fact, I haven't felt any actual pain since the first time you worked on me, only an occasional bit of discomfort. Before long, that will be gone as well, said Yeshua, sidling over to stand at the head of the table. He glanced around at the crowd of the eager faces. In 3 days, we'll embark on a new journey. We have several capable healers who will be able to work with people standing or sitting or lying on cots. But there will be 5 of us doing specialized work, who will require these tables. Or tables like them, Joseph inserted pointedly, only better. Yeshua laughed heartily and beamed a smile of appreciation at Joseph. I'd like to invite each of these practitioners to step up to a table and select someone to work on. Deborah? Deborah strode to the table on the end nearest her, to Yeshua's left. Radiating an unshakable confidence, she scanned the group. Slightly above average in size for a Judean woman, her hair half-grayed, with nothing noteworthy about her appearance, Deborah nevertheless cut an impressive figure. I love a good challenge. Gordian? Would you like to come forth? Without hesitation, Gordian stepped out of the crowd. After what Yeshua and the rest of you did for me this morning, I would never turn down an opportunity to let you people work your wonders on me. I like your will to live, Deborah told him. For those of you who don't know, several years ago, in battle, Gordian took a sword in the abdomen. A few whispers of wonderment passed through the assembled, but probably all of you know that it's rare for anyone to survive such a wound. I wasn't in the mood for dying, Gordian said nonchalantly as he climbed onto her table. But now the will to live can become the will to heal. I'm fed up with struggling with my health. I want to live, not merely survive. Yeshua nodded in appreciation. Since I'm going to be spending most of my time traveling the country, I won't be able to personally attend to you on a regular basis, Gordian. But when I'm in town during the major holidays, I'll help Deborah and the others restore your health completely. Yeshua gestured toward the table between his and Deborah's. Mary? Mary skipped gleefully to the table. I don't care so much for challenges. I'd rather do something interesting. Longinus? Her invitation caught Longinus off guard. He had thought he would only be an observer this day, so he stood motionless, wearing a bewildered expression. He lived a life of exemplary health, and had no idea why Mary would ask him to occupy her table. In the awkward moment that ensued, Roshaya called out from the other side of the crowd, "That's an order, Centurion!" Recovering from his surprise, Longinus stalked toward the table, but instead of lying down, he stood at the foot of the table facing Mary. He held his hands out in a questioning gesture. "What are you gonna do? Make me stronger?" His jest elicited an uproarious response all around. As the hubbub diminished, Zephyrus called out, "You're gonna need it, Longinus. I hereby challenge you to a sparring match." The atrium fell silent. Mary's invitation had surprised him, but the challenge from Zephyrus left Longinus gaping in complete stupefaction. Paneas sat up from the table and stared at Zephyrus. "Are you serious?" "Wouldn't it be interesting?" asked Zephyrus. Paneas nodded numbly. "To say the least. But you're going to use wooden practice swords. There will be no blood spilled from my two best men." Zephyrus grinned at Paneas and then at Longinus. "Agreed." "Perfect!" exclaimed Hotep. "We can rent the amphitheater and charge admission." "Terrific idea, Hotep," Joseph exclaimed. "We'll use the amphitheater. We can have superior seating that way, especially for a close-in battle. I hereby volunteer to handle all the arrangements." Still grinning into the widened eyes of Longinus, Zephyrus added, "We'll use the Alexian scoring method." Without breaking his eye contact with Longinus, Zephyrus asked, "Modestus, would you like to officiate?" "Like to?" came the enthusiastic reply from Modestus. "That would be 100 times better than a front-row seat. I would pay double admission for it." "Accepted," Joseph quipped. "Is anyone else volunteering to pay double? Triple?" "I'm more interested in the wagers," Lazarus responded. "I'll gladly handle those," Joseph responded instantly. "We'll discuss the specifics later," Zephyrus announced. "But now let's get back to something far more important." He playfully glared at Longinus. "On the table, Centurion. That's an order." Longinus bowed his head toward Zephyrus. "Yes, sir." "How sportsmanlike of you, Zephyrus. You're willing to let Mary make me stronger before our match." As Longinus lay his mighty frame upon Mary's table, in the midst of the jubilant chatter, Yeshua made a sweeping gesture toward the table on the end opposite Deborah's to his right. "Joanna?" "Hotep?" Joanna sang forth, as she moved to the head of her table. "Thank you," shouted Hotep. He pounced forward onto the table with unbridled glee. Yeshua allowed a moment for the excitement to settle. His energy shifted, and the peaceful calm of his facial expression seemed to softly envelop the room. With a special depth of feeling in his voice, he gave a slight bow of his head. "Martha?" His demeanor spoke of deep love and respect. Martha glided across the mosaic floor into position at the head of the table on Yeshua's immediate right. Throughout her energy field, she could sense the special attention of the crowd supporting her with profound honor. In the wake of such recognition from Yeshua, the collective energy of the assemblage accorded her an unquestioning deference. Unseen and unfelt by anyone else, Yeshua's love entered her heart more fully than ever before. Her consciousness rose above mundane emotion into the bliss of pure divine love. Follow your heart, Martha. The inner voice belonged to Yeshua as much as it did to herself, and under its influence, Martha drifted into the perfect clarity of her heart. Eumelia? Bedazzled in a sense of unreality, Eumelia's physical vision literally quivered. She could barely sense herself moving toward Martha. Eumelia marveled at the illusion that she remained immobile while the room slowly floated into position to place Martha's table beside her. The undulating fluctuations in her field of vision drifted into her periphery as she gazed into Martha's eyes. "Thank you, Martha." But audible words could not come forth. Eumelia's throat felt completely constricted. Martha's voice abounded with tenderness. "Lie down, dear." It seemed all the memories of Eumelia's life flowed through her awareness, from the wonders of early childhood, through the sudden tragedy of her family's fate, into the years of slavery. And here she gently reclined in a place of wonderment, reveling in the memories of loving Zephyrus, encountering Yeshua, dancing at the banquet, and being accepted by Martha. "I love you, Martha." But the words could not enter the atrium through her voice, but rather melted within her consciousness and poured forth into the atrium as tears. Chapter 17. I think it was destroyed. More than 200 people had come out to the Mount of Olives to hear Yeshua speak. He had chosen a relatively flat, open area at the base of the mountain, where a small rock outcropping provided a natural stage. Behind Yeshua, at a slightly higher elevation, a dozen tents of different sizes were interspersed among the olive trees. "You have an array of healing tools at your disposal every day," Yeshua asserted. "What about sunshine? What about laughter? What about your own will to be well?" He paused, scanning the audience. Of the new faces, roughly half were showing signs of disappointment. All they want is someone to fix them. Among the other new faces, he noted an even mix of enthusiasm and inquisitiveness. Nearly all of them had arrived in hopes of being healed, no matter how minor their illnesses or injuries. Others wanted to witness what Yeshua could do, to ascertain if it would be worthwhile bringing the seriously ill to him. No healing tool is more powerful than your own consciousness. Your beliefs, your faith, will determine your results more than anything else. And what about God? The question came from Nathanael, the young priest who once again dressed as an ordinary workman and called himself Daniel. As he had done before, Nathanael stood in the center, immediately behind those who were seated on the ground. He occasionally asked extraneous questions in hopes of marring Yeshua's presentation. "Is God infinite, Daniel?" asked Yeshua, making sure to use the phony name so as not to reveal his knowledge of Nathanael's misrepresentation. Once again, Nicodemus had taken advantage of his inside information from the temple and had apprised Yeshua of Nathanael's plans. Acting at the behest of the high priest Caiaphas, Nathanael pretended to be a sincere seeker, but sought to disrupt and undermine whatever Yeshua did. "God is great," Nathanael answered cautiously. "God is the ultimate good. I remain unsure about your philosophy of infinity." Yeshua smiled widely. "If God is not infinite, then God is tiny when compared to infinity. Do you believe God is tiny?" Nathanael desperately tried to maintain his affectation of merely wanting to understand, but his body language and facial expressions kept betraying him. This time, his momentarily clenched fists and jaw could be seen by dozens of people, even people who had not seen Yeshua before, much less Nathanael needling Yeshua, were becoming irritated with Nathanael's obvious act of playing devil's advocate. "I propose to you that God is truly infinite," Yeshua continued instead of waiting for Nathanael to respond. "And as such, God is in everything. In this world, God is not readily apparent in everything, but is more apparent in some things and less apparent in others. God sings to the world through your laughter. God kisses the world through your kindness. God heals the world in many ways, but mainly through your consciousness." "Rabbi," called out a young man sitting on a rock a few feet to Nathanael's left, "doesn't this indicate we can block God from expressing in the world through ourselves?" "Excellent question," Yeshua acknowledged, pacing slowly on his little stage. "It shows your thinking. We are always exercising choice in every moment of our lives. Choosing from love allows God to express more freely through us, and choosing from fear does exactly the opposite. Your choices create your life. You can choose to inhibit the God within, and eventually reap the harvest of denying God. Or you can enhance your health and healing if you choose to allow the love of God to express through your thoughts, your feelings, your words, and your deeds." "Are you saying we have power over God?" asked Nathanael, now genuinely scandalized. "If we can block God from expressing through us, as you say, then we are more powerful than God himself." Yeshua threw out his arms joyously. "I am saying you are God. Are you more powerful than yourself?" Yeshua's delivery of the question exuded some amusement and joy. The somber energy of the audience finally dissolved into laughter and chatter, especially among Yeshua's friends, most of whom sat on boulders off to either side. Sounds of merriment facilitated a change in the atmosphere. "As God, you have a responsibility," Yeshua called out gleefully. You have a responsibility to actively love this world and everything it comprises, because God is in everything. If you claim to love God, but do not show love to others or to nature, then you are a liar and a hypocrite. Now that the energy of the crowd had opened, Yeshua flew into a passionately happy oration. Yes, God is in everything. God is in your consciousness, and as God, you have a responsibility to act accordingly. Cheering erupted in several sections of the audience. Many regarded this as the long-awaited victory of Yeshua over Nathanael, especially Yeshua's inner circle, who remembered Nathanael's true identity, applauded as they vociferously supported Yeshua. And now I am offering you an opportunity, Yeshua called out over the fading commotion. Here is your opportunity to demonstrate that you have the courage to become responsible for your own health. Do you see the tents behind me? My friends and I are extending an invitation to those of you who are willing to assume full responsibility for your lives and your health. In a moment, this presentation will end. Through eye contact and a subtle nod, Yeshua signaled Nicodemus to begin walking forward from the back of the crowd. If you are willing to exercise a little faith, if you at least have the sincerity and the faith to attempt this, then you may accompany my friends to the tents. We possess a wide variety of tools and techniques to support your health, and we offer them as assistance to your own will to be well. Yeshua affected surprise at Nicodemus emerging from the listeners standing at the back. Moving forward to the edge of the rock stage, Yeshua fell silent and gazed with rapt attention, which was not feigned. He felt nearly giddy with anticipation. On either side, Yeshua's friends followed his lead, which directed all attention to Nicodemus. This included Nathanael, whose countenance visibly crumbled under the glaring eyes of Nicodemus, standing no more than 15 feet away. Most of the assemblage did not need to see the garments of a chief priest. Nearly everyone who lived in Jerusalem would recognize the imposing figure of Nicodemus, regardless of his attire. "I thought I recognized your voice, Nathanael," Nicodemus growled into the sudden silence. "He says his name is Daniel," shouted Lazarus, as planned. Nicodemus kept his eyes fixed on the young priest. "So I heard." Nicodemus took a few menacing steps closer to Nathanael. "Is this how you respect the priesthood?" Gasps and exclamations of surprise arose from the audience, and whispers of realization circulated rapidly. "Look at you!" cried Nicodemus, gesturing toward Nathanael with both hands. "Are you ashamed of being a priest, Nathanael?" Whatever may have been left of Nathanael's countenance shattered and crumbled before the display of righteous fury in front of him. Caught off guard, he was so frightened and humiliated, his voice had seemingly died within his tightened throat. With stature a little smaller than average, he cut a pathetic figure as his posture slumped. Nicodemus had no need of making believe his anger. He abhorred Caiaphas and his minions, and utterly detested pretentious little errand boys like Nathanael. Nicodemus moved forward to within 10 feet of the devastated young priest. Glaring at him even more intensely, Nicodemus roared, "You dress like this, and you give a false name? Don't you take any pride in serving as a temple priest, Nathanael?" Not a word arose from anyone. Aside from the surrounding bird song and the general dissonance of the city to the south, nothing could be heard but a few rustling sounds from audience members as they adjusted their positions to get a clearer view. Moving forward to within 5 feet of Nathanael, and ominously drawing himself up to full height, Nicodemus towered over Yeshua's antagonist. In a growl that everyone could hear, he asked, "Does Caiaphas know what you're doing?" Nathanael's face and body twitched as he scrambled for a response Caiaphas would approve. "No," he cried as though pleading. "I decided to do this on my own, I swear." No one needed any kind of special insight to perceive the lie. Obviously, Caiaphas knew what Nathanael was doing. If Caiaphas knew, then Caiaphas more than approved. An underling such as Nathanael would only undertake such a venture as an assignment. Everyone in the audience took it for granted that Caiaphas had sent Nathanael here to interfere with Yeshua. Pointing toward the city, Nicodemus leaned forward. "You get yourself back to the temple and tell Caiaphas what you've done." Not for a moment did the blazing eyes of Nicodemus fail to wilt the young priest. "As for me, I came here for 2 reasons. First, to hear for myself what the young rabbi has to say, but second, and more importantly, to see what he has to offer in the realm of healing. Tell Caiaphas I will tender a full report, if he has any interest." In his confusion and fright, Nathanael could only shuffle his feet indecisively. He suddenly found himself mortified at knowing he would have to face the wrath of Caiaphas for this failure. "Move!" thundered Nicodemus, encroaching a half-step closer and pointing emphatically toward the city. Backing away awkwardly, Nathanael tripped over a rock and sprawled at the feet of a group of unsympathetic people. No one made a move to help him to his feet. A few even drew their hands back to their chests or their abdomens, as though Nathanael were unclean, and they dared not defile themselves by touching him. To some of the onlookers, it appeared that Nicodemus had knocked Nathanael down with the sheer power of his voice. The people behind Nathanael spontaneously moved aside, opening a pathway for his retreat. Nicodemus positioned himself to watch Nathanael slink away. Only once did the young priest look back, and the sight of the glowering Nicodemus with his hands on his hips inspired Nathanael to hasten his pace and not look back again. The sound of the cheering crowd fueled his apprehension at the thought of facing Caiaphas. As the crowd settled, everyone focused their attention on the place Nathanael had occupied. Nicodemus now stood there, facing Yeshua. "Forgive us, Rabbi. It seems the priesthood was not appropriately represented here today. I have been standing quietly at the back, listening to all you have said. May I share my perspective?" Yeshua opened his arms wide in a welcoming gesture. "By all means. Your name is well known among us, Nicodemus, as is your reputation as a healer." "In my own healing practice," Nicodemus began, "I have found my greatest success to lie with those who are willing to change their habits and take part in their own healing. Most often, the illnesses are caused by poor habits. I never waste my time on anyone who wants to continue the same old habits that caused the illness in the first place. And when someone like that still expects me to heal them, I send them out the door with the kind of ceremony with which I just dismissed young Nathaniel." A spattering of applause punctuated the rumble of appreciative commentary throughout the audience. "Forgive us for the disruption. Please continue your talk. I find your ideas challenging, but interesting." "Thank you," Yeshua responded. He gazed out over the assemblage. "If there are any others willing to accept responsibility for their health and to exercise their faith, please go to the large tent in the center behind me. From there, we can determine which tent you can go to and who can best help you." Most of Yeshua's friends immediately began the short climb toward the tents, and Nicodemus launched into a purposeful stride forward. A few dozen others followed the lead. Soon a fourth of the crowd had moved past the little outcropping on which Yeshua had stood, surveying the energy of those who remained. Yeshua sadly shook his head. "For the rest of you, I'm sorry. There isn't much we can do for you. God helps those who help themselves. If you put no effort forth, what is there for the Spirit to bless?" A few more people broke away from the reluctant portion of the crowd and started walking up toward the tents. Yeshua pointed to his right. "In the last tent, you will find we have brought food and water to share with you. Please feel free to refresh yourselves before going your way." A couple dozen people immediately headed for the food tent. From the back of the shrinking crowd, a middle-aged man shouted, "Take me up there! I want to go to the healing tents." His 2 young adult sons had brought him to the Mount of Olives on a stretcher, which was propped against a boulder at an angle that allowed him to watch. The sons were trying to convince their father that Yeshua was a charlatan, not a man of God. Yeshua called out to them, "We will carry him up to the tents and make sure he gets home afterward." Without waiting for a response, Yeshua glanced over at 4 of his friends and nodded in the direction of the man on the stretcher. The 2 sons lost their will to object when they saw Lazarus, Zephyrus, Hotep, and Roshiah marching toward them. "What's your name, brother?" asked Lazarus as they drew near. "Josiah," the gentleman answered. He threw a dismissive glance at his sons. "But these 2 don't have names, at least not names they seem to live up to." As Yeshua promised, "We'll make sure your father gets home safely," Roshiah assured the hesitant young men. The older one started to object, but Roshiah said firmly, "My name is Roshiah. You evidently don't recognize me, but you undoubtedly know my name and reputation. I will personally see to it that your father is returned home safely." As Yeshua had suggested for such circumstances, Roshaya did not wait for a response, but simply hoisted his corner of the stretcher in concert with Zephyrus, Lazarus, and Hotep. The two young men stood with arms folded across their chests, watching the stretcher move swiftly toward the tents. Jubilant sounds from their father made a mockery of them, as they seethed in sullen resentment. The younger one muttered, "Let's go home." His older brother said, "No, let's go see what kind of food they're offering." The sides of the healing tent were rolled up to achieve the optimal combination of ventilation and shade. Yeshua and Mary had been working busily at their tables for over 2 hours. More than a dozen onlookers lounged around the periphery. Some had been partially treated, others fully treated, and only one remained waiting to begin. Nicodemus made no effort to hide his excitement. He would now have an excuse to sing Yeshua's praises to Caiaphas. While giving the impression of remaining neutral toward the teachings, he would be able to rave about Yeshua's knowledge and abilities as a healer. If nothing else, Nicodemus knew his enthusiasm would force Caiaphas to realize there would not be unswerving support within the Sanhedrin Council if Caiaphas wanted to take action against Yeshua, nor within the priesthood itself. As Yeshua finished working with an elated older woman, Nicodemus asked, "Are you ready yet, Josiah?" "Yes, I have seen enough," replied Josiah. "If I wasn't convinced before, I certainly am now. Get me onto that table." Josiah seemed to be an excitable man of average size, and everyone reveled in his gleeful articulations as Nicodemus easily picked him up and placed him on the table. Josiah's clothing showed some wear of age, much like his body. He struggled to find a comfortable position to lie in, and sighed when he felt his sandals being removed by Nicodemus. Speaking with soft reassurance, Yeshua probed Josiah's body and made his assessment. "This isn't really as bad as it seems," he said, more to Nicodemus than to Josiah. "The right hip was jarred out of position some time ago, and resulted in more of the back being thrown farther and farther out of alignment." Yeshua proceeded to spend several minutes making the initial adjustments, explaining each move to Nicodemus, allowing Nicodemus to feel each area of the body being adjusted, both before and after. Yeshua caught sight of Zephyrus and Hotep walking past the tent. "Zeph? Hotep? Could you ask Martha to come over here and lend a hand when she finishes what she's doing right now?" "Sure," replied Zephyrus, as he peered into the tent, "especially since it's for Joshua." Hotep sidled up to Zephyrus. "Josiah, when Yeshua completes his work on you, we can all take turns carrying each other on your stretcher." Hotep and Zephyrus walked off toward Martha's tent, enjoying the sounds of laughter triggered by Hotep's comment. "When did your hip get thrown out of place?" asked Yeshua. "About a month and a half ago," Josiah replied. "Then my back started to hurt from hobbling around at stupid angles, and everything else fell apart. It's been so upsetting not being able to get work done, and this was the worst Passover I can remember. My family thinks I'm crippled for life. I hope your young friend is right, though. If you can get me walking again, I would gladly join your friends in carrying you around town on a litter. "Thanks for the thought," Yeshua responded with a chuckle, "but I really enjoy walking around on my own power." "Don't give him any ideas, Josiah," Mary quipped. "We don't want him getting an exaggerated opinion of himself. I like living with him the way he is." "This is your wife?" asked Josiah. "Mary and I have been together for 2 years, Yeshua told him. "And you're about to meet her sister, Martha." "Our brother Lazarus was one of the men who carried you up to the tent," said Mary. "Ah, Lazarus," Josiah mused. "A very funny young man. You must have quite a household." "Here comes Martha," said Nicodemus, "with Zephyrus, Hotep, and that beautiful young girl." Josiah made an audible sigh. "Another beautiful girl? I'll be healed for sure, then. Is that the part of your secret, Yeshua? Surround the patient with beautiful women, and his consciousness can't help but heal him?" Martha entered the tent with the others, and Yeshua apprised her of the situation with Josiah. "All right, Martha, you do the right leg. I'll need to apply certain pressures on his back as you do it. Mary, could you stand at his left side? Cup your left hand here and your right hand there. Just let the energies flow." "Magnificent!" exclaimed Josiah, grinning alternately at Mary and Martha. "Now, if I could only see that third beautiful woman, I know my faith would be complete." As everyone chuckled at Josiah's remark, Zephyrus made a quick survey of the scene. "Hotep, stand right next to me here. Eumelia, step in front of us, and we'll hoist you onto our shoulders. You can perch there while they work. Then Josiah can have an unobstructed view of you. This will complete his trinity of beautiful women to accelerate his healing." Eumelia sprang into position. "Anything that helps." Josiah gazed at Mary, Martha, and then at the elevated Eumelia, dressed for the occasion in a simple but tasteful light green robe. "Heavenly," Josiah murmured. "Absolutely heavenly." Yeshua stood at the head of the table and leaned over to place his hands in the appropriate places beneath Josiah's back. "When you're ready, Martha." Moving Josiah's leg into a variety of angles, Martha honed her timing and positioning. "All right, Josiah, I want you to look at Amelia." "Gladly." "And now, very quickly, I want you to shift your gaze to Mary." Josiah's verbal response was cut short, as Martha yanked on his leg with surprising quickness, strength, and finesse. A loud clunk and a few audible pops left the onlookers holding their breath. "Relax, Josiah," Yeshua gently insisted as he examined the body to assess what had been accomplished. He kept muttering, "Excellent." Josiah rotated his widened eyes among the 3 women. "Are you feeling flushed with heat?" Mary asked him. "Yes, it's almost frightening," he answered with a gleam in his eyes. "Your hands are amazingly hot, but the main part of the heat seems to be pouring out of the center of my torso." "Those are your own healing energies," explained Martha. "We all have these energies within us. Without your open attitude, you would have kept the inner gateway closed against your healing." "How nice to know," Josiah said. "With women as beautiful as you 3, I'll be as open as you want me to be." Yeshua spent a few minutes helping Mary, Martha, and Nicodemus understand what had been done. He showed them exactly where to probe and what to feel for, and he outlined the supplemental adjustments yet to be made. 20 minutes later, The work had all been done. When Yeshua felt satisfied, he said, "Josiah, I want you to rest quietly for a while. Remember, you have to do your part. But to encourage you, I'm going to leave you with your 3 female friends, until your body finishes the first phase of adapting. Mary, will you take my place at his head? Martha, you can stay at his feet. Eumelia, will you come down here and take Mary's place? I'll show you where to place your hands." With the spontaneous help of Zephyrus and Hotep, Eumelia gracefully descended from her perch on their shoulders. She ran the few steps around the table to where Mary had been standing, and followed Yeshua's instructions for the laying on of hands. Yeshua smiled in satisfaction. "I'm going to go check on the other tents." Josiah asked, "Yeshua, am I allowed to talk while I'm recuperating?" Sidling his way through the onlookers, Yeshua answered, "Yes. In fact, it'll help." "Can I flirt with them?" "That's not my decision to make," Yeshua called back over his shoulder. "You can flirt all you want to," Mary told Josiah. "Not that it'll do you any good," added Martha kindly but firmly, speaking in what Lazarus now called her matriarchal voice. "That's right," Eumelia concurred, with a mischievous twinkle in her eyes. "All 3 of us are spoken for." Her favorite impish grin emerged, and she gave Zephyrus and Martha pointed looks. Mary burst into giggles, and Hotep guffawed as boisterously as Lazarus would have, at the sight of Martha's frozen expression, contrasted with Zephyrus blushing, with both of them too embarrassed to look at each other. Nicodemus joined in the fun. It provided a rare treat for the group, to hear the sound of a chief priest surrendering to the joyfulness of the moment. Although the others in the tent had no idea what the joke was, the giggles became contagious. "This is the sound of God singing into our world," exclaimed Josiah. "Yeshua mentioned it right along with sunshine as a medicine. I'm healed." The 5 men slowed to a halt at the base of the narrow street that sloped up into the eastern part of the lower city. Modest houses lined both sides of the street and gave the impression for competing for space. The sun was near to setting, and illumined the light-colored stone walls of the houses near the top. "I live about halfway up, on the left," Josiah told the others. "All right, then," said Nicodemus rather sternly. "We're going to put you back on your stretcher, and no arguments." Josiah held out his hands in a sign of innocence. "Me argue? No, as a matter of fact, this'll be fun. My sons will be there with my wife, waiting for me to return, still all crippled. The 3 of them will feel vindicated when they see me on the stretcher." "Brilliant!" exclaimed Hotep. "When they see you get up and walk without a limp, their expressions will be precious." As they steadied the stretcher, Zephyrus added, "We can play this up. Let's carry him as though it was his own funeral procession." "Excellent idea, Zeph," agreed Roshaiah. "The stronger the contrast between his posture before and after, the funnier his family's expressions will be." Josiah climbed onto the stretcher without assistance, and lay back as though he were still suffering. With dejected expressions in carriage, the 4 friends began trudging up the hill with their burden. Zephyrus and Nicodemus took the front, Roshaiah and Hotep the rear. All 4 lowered their heads as though grieving. A few neighbors in the streets alerted Josiah's family of his return, and his wife stalked out into the street, flanked by her 2 sons. They stood with their arms folded, and came near to gloating as they watched the somber procession approach. 4 men with heads bowed, and a motionless Josiah on the stretcher. The young son whispered to his mother, "See, we told you the truth. It's Nicodemus himself, and that's Roshaiah behind him." "Well, let's not be rude then," she muttered. Zephyrus looked up as they drew within about 10 feet of Josiah's family. "This is good enough. We can leave him here." The 4 bearers halted, and Josiah lay still. Nicodemus scowled at Josiah's wife, then turned the same scowl on Josiah. "Now, do you promise before God you will follow Yeshua's instructions without fail?" "I do solemnly promise," replied Josiah. Nicodemus grunted in pretended skepticism. "All right, then. We have discharged our duty, and we leave you under your own recognizance." Nicodemus and Zephyrus lowered the front of the stretcher to the cobblestones, while Hotep and Roshaiah gradually hoisted the back end. Josiah delicately slid off into the standing position. With no traceable limp, he walked around his dumbfounded family toward the house. "Since I'm not allowed to do any lifting for a week, you can bring the stretcher inside for me. Not that I'll be needing it." "If you don't obey Yeshua's instructions," Nicodemus called after him gruffly, "and if you end up needing this stretcher again, I'll knock you off the stretcher and hit you over the head with it." Nicodemus decided to indulge in a bit of name-dropping. "You can carry it inside for him, Zephyrus." "Can I hit him with it?" asked Zephyrus. Nicodemus pretended to ponder the question. "No, not yet. Let's give him a chance to show his worthiness." "Aw," Zephyrus moaned as he feigned bitter disappointment. "You're never any fun." Zephyrus grabbed the stretcher as though it were nearly weightless, and followed Josiah toward the front door of the house. "I don't like your family's attitudes, Josiah," Zephyrus declared loudly enough for everyone in the street to hear. "Maybe Nicodemus would let me hit each of them with your stretcher." "Go right ahead," Josiah responded, also speaking loudly enough to be heard by his family. "Although they deserve it, you won't knock any sense into them, any more than you could light a fire underwater." Nicodemus proceeded to point his right index finger at Josiah's wife and sons as he addressed them. "He is not to do any lifting or heavy work for a week, nor is he allowed to do too much walking. I will personally check up on him 1 week from today." Nicodemus had always enjoyed the game of intimidating people, and he now loved every cowering reaction as he detailed Yeshua's instruction for Josiah's full recovery. When Zephyrus and Josiah walked back out into the street to join the growing throng, Nicodemus grinned at Josiah. "Satisfied?" Josiah bowed slightly. "The 4 of you performed admirably. You could all be actors." The 4 let down their serious facades and happily joked with Josiah as they each embraced him and wished him well. Their fun was fueled by the stupefaction displayed by Josiah's family and neighbors. Aside from the jesting of these 5 men who had returned from Yeshua's first public healing session, not a word was spoken. The people of this neighborhood had witnessed a miracle, and the very concept of miracles became associated with the name Yeshua in their minds. Josiah walked into his house, and the other 4 marched away down the sloping cobblestone street. The small gathering of neighbors remained in the street, hardly daring to look at each other, but staring at the 4 surprised visitors now leaving the neighborhood. Among those 4 strangers, these people had heard 3 famous names: Nicodemus of the Sanhedrin Council, healer and chief priest; Roshaiah, the chief centurion, a practicing Hebrew, whose name stood for unquestioned honor; Zephyrus, the right-hand man of the governor himself. In a voice bordering on awe, Josiah's younger son mumbled, "Nicodemus, Roshaiah, and Zephyrus. Did anyone catch the name of the other one?" "No," his older brother growled, "but whoever he was, he looked important. And they all served this Yeshua character. I think this is going to spell trouble for all the land of Israel." "I've heard Yeshua's a blasphemer," their mother added, making no effort to hide her sullen resentment as she watched the retreating backs of the 4 strangers. She and her sons remained sulking in the street as the gaggle of neighbors quietly dissolved. "That was so much fun!" exclaimed Roshaiah, once he was sure that they were out of earshot. "All those people acted like they were seeing ghosts and phantoms from the underworld." Zephyrus asked, "Do you think their sense of reality has been challenged?" "No, I think it was destroyed," answered Hotep. "Yeshua has embarked on his new journey, and I'm simply abounding with gratitude that I have the privilege of accompanying him. How many more of these miracles are we going to witness?" "I never thought I would envy a slave," Nicodemus murmured, gazing in delighted wonderment at Hotep. "You get to travel with Yeshua." Zephyrus gave Nicodemus a playful nudge. "Don't fool yourself, Nicodemus. You're every bit as enslaved as the rest of us." Chapter 18. It's a contest of righteousness. Zephyrus asked, "How far back in Judean history do you have to go to find where this messianic theory became a mass obsession?" The 10-way conversation around the Magdalene's table had covered a lot of ground, expounding on Hebrew history and ideology over the course of several centuries. Most of the discussion had taken place in Aramaic. Every now and then, something would be explained in Greek for Hotep and Eumelia. Although both of them were learning Aramaic quickly, complex subjects were being discussed. Messianic fascination reached the point of insanity around the time of Maccabees, Lazarus replied. It had grown to importance in Hebrew thinking for centuries before then. After the return from the Babylonian exile, the concept of a Messiah was borrowed from the Babylonians and Persians, and the idea took root in Judaic thinking. But the conflict with Antiochus Epiphanes blew it all out of proportion. Lazarus slouched back in his chair at the head of the table and smirked. "Look at some of these good Hebrew faces here at the table. They freeze at the thought of admitting we grew up in a mentally imbalanced society." He threw his hands into the air. "Yes, it's all out of proportion. And I agree with Zeph. It's a mass obsession over a theory that makes no sense." Behind Lazarus, the late morning sun highlighted the green of the plants outside the open windows. His oration seemed incongruent with the beauty of the birdsong and the more distant sounds of children playing. Lazarus did not feel in the mood for playing. Zephyrus occupied the first chair on the side of the table to the right of Lazarus. Zephyrus wanted to stay on the topic of historic fact. He leaned slightly leftward and held his right hand out, palm upward, as though asking Lazarus to hand over some knowledge. Antiochus Epiphanes was the Seleucid king who outlawed Judaism, right? Lazarus ignored the question and gestured down the table to his left, wanting to take specific others to task for their unspoken reactions to his blunt rejection of messianic theory. Joanna, you caught your breath and held it. Eumelia, you're not Hebrew, so you're fine. Martha, your body jolted and your eyes bulged. Mary, you weren't as bad, but you immediately looked over at Yeshi for reassurance. And how did I do? Asked a genial Yeshua from the other end of the table. You exist beyond all the religiosity, so you're exempt, answered Lazarus, grinning mischievously at Yeshua. Lazarus sat up and leaned forward. He commenced indicating each person to his right, from Yeshua's end of the table back toward himself. Joseph barely raised his eyebrows, and he did so mostly in amusement, because Joseph basically doesn't give a damn. I admire that. Our resident chief priest, on the other hand, almost choked. But we can forgive Nicodemus, because he's new to Yeshi and his teachings. But we get no mercy? Asked Mary. Her voice and body language indicated a lack of concern for her brother's denunciation. No, you don't get any mercy, Lazarus insisted. You 3 stellar students on my left have been with Yeshi for 2 years. You should know better. He glanced to his right again. Hotep and Zephyrus aren't Hebrew, so they're merely trying to figure out what all the madness is about. But it's in their blood, said Hotep in an easy manner. He smiled graciously across the table. I will gladly grant them mercy. They're descended from generations of breeding in a religious fervor, and they were born and raised in this fervor at a time when it had reached fever pitch. So was I, Lazarus proclaimed, but I don't spasm with guilt when I hear the facts about our culture. Hotep wanted to ease the tensions, but also wanted to learn the history. How long ago did the Maccabees rebel against the Seleucid king? What was his name again? And what was this about him outlawing Judaism? Lazarus and Martha started speaking at the same time, but stopped and gave each other exasperated looks. Zephyrus reached over and rubbed Lazarus on the shoulder. I think you've made your point, Lazarus, Joseph said with his customary detached amusement. Why don't you give your sister a chance to redeem herself? Lazarus dampened his intensity and chortled. All right, Joseph, I will defer to my wise older sister. He held up his left hand in a signal for Martha to wait, because he had not finished deferring. Under the condition that she confesses she still has a little transcendence to achieve in this area. I confess, Martha responded quickly. Joanna reached over to Lazarus and laid her hand on his forearm. Messianism creates a lot of intense conditioning for us to overcome, dear, and the rest of us aren't as adept at this as you are. Good idea, Joanna, exclaimed Nicodemus. Dissuade him with compliments. Grinning at Lazarus, Nicodemus made it clear he was not going to allow himself to be provoked. How about a little empathy, Lazarus? If you're going to follow Yeshua's teaching, follow them all. Imagine growing up in a powerful family of priests, always wanting to do what's right, but having right and wrong so rigidly defined as painstaking detail, there would be no room to think for yourself. In fact, thinking for yourself would be considered wrong. That's almost beyond my capacity to comprehend, said Eumelia, gazing in amazement at Nicodemus. It would be like growing up in a black and white world without even shades of gray, much less any colors. Mary leaned forward to look around Martha. That was pretty good Aramaic, Emilia. Lazarus emitted one of his obnoxious guffaws. Fine. Compliments all around. Everybody's wonderful. He made a silly face at Martha. Zephyrus and Hotep are still waiting for their history lesson on messianic lunacy. In answer to your question, Hotep, Martha began, it was nearly 2 centuries ago that Antiochus Epiphanes outlawed Judaism. As you might imagine, the Hebrew people had gone to considerable lengths to avoid living as model citizens of the Hellenistic Empire. Much like now, said Hotep. The Roman governors have to do a continuous juggling act to prevent a general uprising or a civil war. Mary perked up and leaned forward, suddenly fascinated. Could you give us an example of something Pontius has to do that the other governors of the empire don't? For one, he has to keep the majority of his troops stationed in Syria, replied Hotep. Otherwise, he runs the risk of appearing too oppressive. The Romans have to minimize their visible presence within Judea, especially in Jerusalem, to avoid the risk of inciting an armed rebellion. It certainly wasn't that way in Egypt. Nor in any other province in the empire, added Zephyrus. Here's another example. We only come to Jerusalem during the holidays, because those are the times when trouble is most likely to start. We need to be ready to crush opposition decisively before it infects the whole country. Otherwise, we stay out. The less often people see us here, the better. It's a delicate balancing act, observed Yeshua. Your administration needs its most visible presence during the most volatile time, and in Jerusalem, no less, the touchiest place. You might notice something else, Joseph interjected. Most of the regular Jerusalem garrison is made up of mercenaries, Germans and the like. They're not really Romans, which eases the situation, and they're free about spending their money in certain parts of town, which renders them tolerable, if not welcome. But back to the history lesson, Hotep prompted Martha. Antiochus Epiphanes finally lost his patience with the people, Martha continued, so he outlawed Judaism. He carried his oppression too far, however. He took over the temple and turned it into a shrine dedicated to Zeus. Really? Asked Hotep, clearly stunned at the thought. He leaned toward Zephyrus and mumbled, Can you imagine Pontius attempting something like that? Armed revolution would erupt in a heartbeat, Hotep nodded to Martha. So more than anything, the rededication of the temple ignited the Maccabean revolt. But do you see the real problem? Asked Joanna. They always resort to violence to resolve the issue, and all they do is beget more violence. Yes, their violence is a problem, Lazarus moaned. But another problem is the notion that every unfavorable turn of events is punishment from a wrathful God for not being righteous enough. True, Joseph concurred. And of course the people can't agree on exactly what constitutes righteousness. We end up with sect after sect after sect, all fighting over how to be righteous enough to win the favor of the wrathful God. As you might imagine, the sects all judge and condemn each other. How many sects are there? Asked Hotep. More than we can count, replied Mary. And some of them get violent within Judaism itself, heedless of the Romans. You mean the groups physically fight each other over ideas of morality or holiness? Asked Eumelia. Nearly all the violence is committed by the Scari, answered Martha. Those are the zealot groups who assassinate other Hebrews for allegedly not living up to the law. I've encountered some of these fanatics, recalled Zephyrus, seeing a vivid image of Hezreel in his mind's eye. The Scari are named after the Scarius, which is a form of dagger. As an aside to Hotep, he added, "It's no match for a Pugio." "Are you serious?" asked Eumelia, glancing from face to face. "They murder people with daggers for not obeying a bunch of rules or something? That's horrible." Joanna reached over and patted Eumelia's thigh. "Sad but true, dear. We are descended from extremely violent people, and I don't see things improving unless Yeshe can make a strong enough impact on our nation." "One quirk of the social consciousness," put in Yeshua, "is the people's proclivity for being misled. Add emotional volatility to their penchant for accepting wild assertions, and you have a formula for disaster. Hence our long history of disasters," added Joanna. "But what are the sects arguing about?" asked Hotep. "I've heard a little about the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes, but I don't know enough about them. Do those three compose the majority of the population?" "Not even close," Joseph responded. "But those three are the most influential. Unfortunately, the Sadducees and the Pharisees have opted for political power-mongering, but the Essenes prefer to live in isolated communities where they can deny their humanness. Even though they have a more sensible spiritual understanding than the others, they have an absurd notion of what righteousness entails. They avoid sex as though it were a plague instead of a gift." "Really?" asked Eumelia. "Well, who do they think created sex?" She glanced around the table at the variety of reactions. Everyone but Joanna found her question humorous, and Martha only mildly so. Eumelia smirked and made a dismissive gesture. "Well, I think that's all I care to hear about the Essenes for now." Eumelia noted that Mary was the only woman laughing as heartily as the men. "But help me understand the other two groups. What's the main difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees?" "Both agree on finding favor with God through following the laws of Moses," Nicodemus told her. "The Pharisees want to expand on the law until they have a rule for every possible contingency in life." He smiled kindly at Eumelia. "And as you so adroitly expressed it, the Pharisees try to create a black and white world for us to live in. But the Sadducees teach their people to think a bit more for themselves, to obey the law, but also to develop a sense of ethics." "I'm starting to understand," said Hotep. "They're all trying to figure out how to act sufficiently righteous so they can earn their God's favor. And if their God should finally determine the people are obedient enough, he would reward them by making their conquerors disappear into thin air." "Pretty stupid, isn't it?" asked Lazarus. "They think their petty little tribal god is going to send a spiritual hero, a Messiah, who can somehow perform the miracle of instilling proper religiosity into the people. And then, of course, their bigoted little god will kick out the Romans and assign the Hebrews as the righteous rulers of all the earth. It's a mass delusion. But that could never happen, Emilia stated emphatically. An imaginary god can't make an empire disappear. And there we find the danger, Emilia, said Yeshua. The Hebrews have carried a pattern down through the centuries, or even millennia. The what? Asked Emilia. Sorry, but I'm not familiar with that last word. Thousands of years, whispered Martha. The same pattern repeats all throughout their history, Yeshua continued. They believe they must act as the agents of their God, and carry out His will on His behalf. And that's when they resort to violence on a massive scale, muttered Joanna. But it's all right, because their God told them to do it, Joseph said sarcastically. Kill, maim, dismember, mutilate, destroy, rape, pillar, plunder, all in the name and agency of their God. Sacred ravaging. How do you think we ended up living on this land? Asked Mary. Our ancestors conquered it by main force, because they believed God wanted them to do it. Joseph nudged Nicodemus. They believed God wanted them to conquer the land, because that's what the priests told them. And most of the people wanted to believe it, added Yeshua. The priests and the so-called prophets have often given voice to what the people wanted to hear. They create the illusion of divine validation for the people's bloodlust and greed. But when their turn comes to be conquered, Zephyrus put in, they view it as a punishment from the same God for not performing proper acts of worship or obeying meaningless laws. He groaned, set his elbows on the table, and held his head in his hands. My head is growing heavier by the minute. And their turn always comes, Yeshua emphasized. In the East, the word karma expresses this principle. Whatever you do to others will eventually be done to you. On an individual level, it may take a few lifetimes for it to catch up to you. Likewise, on a national or tribal level, it may take a few generations. But everything you put out into the world will find its way back to you, individually and collectively, and you will reap the harvest of what you've sown. Zephyrus flopped forward and clunked his forehead on the table. He kept his face on the tabletop as he covered his head with his hands. And I'm working for the Roman Empire, so I share in its crimes. I am so doomed. Yeshua let loose an uproarious guffaw, and the tensions around the table shattered as everyone allowed themselves to enjoy the comic relief. Zephyrus flew into entertainment mode. He lifted his head and looked around cross-eyed, not focusing on anyone. May the gods have mercy on my soul. If there are gods, Joseph managed to say in the midst of his laughter. If there is mercy, added Nicodemus. There is no mercy, Lazarus shouted. There is only karma. The previously heavy energy was quickly washed in a rush of silliness. Slumping back in his chair, Zephyrus drew his Pugio and held it to his heart. Death, doom, and damnation! No, no, no! Squealed Emilia, giggling as she leapt up and danced her way around the table. The folds of her beige robe accentuated her fluent motions. She lighted behind Zephyrus, leaned over, and started cuddling him. It's hopeless, Zephyrus groaned. I am doom incarnate. Then stay incarnated, suggested Hotep, gently taking the Pugio away from Zephyrus. Hotep held the Pugio aloft by the bottom of the hilt, rotating it so everyone could see the deadly weapon. The humor soon drained out of the group, and an eerie quiet descended. Their attention remained on the Pugio. "It's a symbol," Hotep mused, "of the dangerous times in which we live." "We know there's going to be trouble," Joanna acknowledged. She lowered her eyes, queasy with the thought that Zephyrus had ended several men's lives with the very blade held forth by Hotep. Lazarus frowned as he stared at the blade. "You can't speak truth in this world without risking a violent reaction." With a slight adjustment of his vision, Lazarus peered beyond the Pugio to focus on Yeshua. "And when you speak nothing but truth, you acquire suitable security," Yeshua softly spoke in his teaching voice. He smiled at Zephyrus, who now sat quietly with the back of his head nestled between Eumelia's breasts, as she stood behind him tenderly running her fingers through his hair. Yeshua's eyes took on their famous faraway expression. Certain souls volunteered their services before incarnating. I will accomplish the mission of anchoring divine love into this brutal world. On one level, it grieves me to realize I will be violently opposed by many whom I seek to benefit. A tear trickled from the corner of his right eye, and I melt with gratitude that these certain souls remain willing to meet the oncoming violence with all the tools at their disposal. Yeshua gave Mary, Martha, and Joanna meaningful glances, even if the tools turn out to be weapons. This would never be my preference, but it's part of the nature of this world, and I don't judge it. It's not as though violence were not part of infinity. Mary, Martha, and Joanna simultaneously sighed. Lazarus wore an uncustomary look of sobriety. "And yet we can minimize the violence," Yeshua murmured, gesturing to his left. "Joseph will employ his intelligence network and financial leverage. Nicodemus will exercise his influence among the power-mongers in the temple. Hotep will surprise us with his versatility and see the mission through to its culmination. Eumelia will find many ways to dissipate the energies of the opposition, and Zephyrus—" Yeshua's voice trailed away, and his eyes drifted into softer focus. "Pontius will execute affairs of state in support of the mission, and Zephyrus," closing his eyes, Yeshua felt his way into the imagery he was seeing. "But it's too dark." He allowed his head to sway. "It's dark beyond my comprehension." Upon reopening, Yeshua's bluish-gray eyes came into sharp focus on Zephyrus, while maintaining their otherworldly vision. "Zephyrus will guide us through our darkest passage. He will cut a pathway where none exists, as though tunneling through solid bedrock." After a moment of silence, Eumelia stirred. "Yeshua? When you were explaining about karma, something happened inside Zephyrus. He felt really serious about it, but he acted out in a silly way to cover what he was feeling." "That's right," agreed Martha. "Something about sharing in the sins of the empire." "Isn't there a way for him to transcend it, Yeshi?" asked Eumelia. "Can't you help him with a broader perspective or something?" "Yes, I can," replied Yeshua calmly. You see, Zeph, you can function within the empire without being part of it. Furthermore, if you work within the system to minimize its crimes, you can exempt yourself from its karma. Is there a trick to it? Asked Zephyrus. In a sense, replied Mary. Yeshi has been showing us how to transcend karma, so we can live in grace. Grace is the secret, or the trick, as you say. Zephyrus nodded slowly. This would be virgin territory for me to explore. I will do everything I can to help you, Zeph, offered Martha. Perhaps more than anything else, moving out of the karma into grace will ease your ascent into the world where I live. I want to learn too, Eumelia said breathlessly. Joseph leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You can count me in as well. I'm intrigued. Hotep leaned to his right, rubbing shoulders with Nicodemus. Are you in too? I can't begin to fathom the concept, Nicodemus admitted. But if it's one of Yeshua's higher teachings, then I'm ready to have more of my illusions dissolved. Hotep sat up straight, and once again held the Pujio up for everyone to see. A symbol to remind us of our danger. And may it always abide in the right hands, murmured Yeshua, leaning forward and grinning mischievously at Zephyrus. This may surprise a few people around here, Zeph, but I'm going to attend your sparring match against Longinus tomorrow. The statement shocked the Magdalenes and Joanna beyond speech. They struggled to imagine Yeshua wanting to watch a Roman military contest. Yeshua shared his amused expression with each of them in turn. I would recommend the rest of you join me. If you think for an instant that the Holy Spirit has placed an inept man in charge of my security in this violent world, you will see otherwise tomorrow. As I perceive events unfolding, serious trouble won't happen for a couple of years, but Caiaphas will most likely order assassination attempts. Who do you think is going to thwart those professional assassins? All eyes were drawn to the upraised Pujio. Hotep sensed the pressure and leaned to his left, repeating Yeshua's words, and may it always abide in the right hands. He proffered the blade hilt first to Zephyrus. I have a funny feeling he's not talking about my hands. For now, would you like to put this where it belongs? And not in your heart, Zeph, Martha said pointedly. She waited until she and Zephyrus had established firm eye contact. Her demeanor softened. Your heart is made for other things. Grace, for example? Zephyrus asked. Eumelia mimicked his inflection. Love, for example? Zephyrus gently sighed and softened the gaze he shared with Martha. She had opened significantly. Everyone around them respectfully allowed them their moment of touching soul to soul. Still, holding Martha's gaze, Zephyrus asked, Could we finish the history lesson later? In this magical moment, I would rather start learning about grace. Staying out of the mid-afternoon sun, Martha lounged on the ground under the canopy of one of the fig trees behind the Magdalene home. Situating her back against the tree trunk, she patiently continued the history lesson for Zephyrus, Eumelia, and Hotep. To facilitate their learning, Martha opted to hold this discussion in Greek. Lazarus gets really upset over this subject, Martha told them, so it's better to explain it when he's not here. I can appreciate his passion, said Hotep. especially if the focal point of the Messianic writing is flagrantly fictional. Emilia piped up. Wait! Can I see if I understand the timeline? Martha smiled sweetly. Sure, dear. The Babylonians began their conquest of this land 632 years ago, Emilia stated carefully. The temple was eventually destroyed, and the rest of the people were led into captivity. Were they all taken to Babylon? Yes, replied Martha. The Babylonians did not follow procedures like the Assyrians, who conquered people and then displaced them all around the map. Another difference, Zephyrus interjected, was that the Babylonians weren't as cruel as the Assyrians. But we can talk about the Assyrians another time. I've heard about the next part, said Emilia, because of where I grew up. The Babylonian captivity lasted for 70 years, and then the Persians conquered the Babylonians and sent the Israelites back here. It's still a really long time ago. And then a couple of 100 years later, Alexander of Macedon conquered just about everybody everywhere, including here. That's why we all speak Greek as our common language. It's kind of convenient, now that I think about it. But with the language came the culture, added Martha, and that alone has caused unprecedented division among our people. Of course, remarked Zephyrus with a touch of disdain. If you adopt Hellenistic influences, your petty tribal god will get mad at you, and then the Hebrews can judge each other for not being Hebrew enough. We left something out, said Hotep. Alexander died young, and the ensuing conflicts divided his empire into 4 power blocks. That's why Egypt was Ptolemaic for so long. Right, agreed Emilia. And we were Seleucid, where the Parthian Empire is now. And as usual, Martha moaned, changing her position to sit cross-legged, the land of Israel got caught in the middle. But it was the Seleucid king who outlawed Judaism, Zephyrus recalled. So for him, this land would have constituted an outlying district of minor importance, much as it is for the Romans today. And still a nuisance, added Hotep. Martha closed her eyes and lowered her head. Tragic, but true. But getting back to the timeline, Emilia insisted. It was a little less than 200 years ago when the real trouble happened. Since the people of this province established themselves as such a nuisance, the Seleucid king outlawed their religion. He evidently thought he could solve the problem with such a ploy, but he obviously made a really bad guess. What was his full name again? Antiochus the 4th Epiphanes, answered Martha. And yes, even his might could not contain the wrath of the people, especially since Judah Maccabee proved himself to be a capable military leader. Oh, I see it now, exclaimed Zephyrus. He jumped to his feet and began pacing under the fig tree. The Hebrews blamed the Hellenized Hebrews for bringing down the wrath of their God upon everyone's heads. These people think everything that goes wrong is a consciously chosen punishment from their deity, and it's always for not obeying all the Hebrew laws and rules and regulations. So now they thought that they had to force themselves and each other to earn their God's favor by being extremely Hebrews. But they could never agree on exactly how that would be accomplished, Hotep observed. That's how they ended up splitting into these petty sects. They're absolutely desperate to please their angry God, and so their reasoning ability gets buried in the midst of their fanaticism. "Hold it!" Emilia called out, waving her hands excitedly. "I think I can put the whole timeline together. Lazarus told us Messianic theory became popular after the Israelites came back from Babylon, but he said it went crazy after the Maccabees rebelled against Antiochus. The Hebrews wanted to believe their God would send them a great Savior to protect them from all the oppression, and especially from having their temple dedicated to another god. And this is where Lazarus gets really mad about the fake writings." Martha doubled over, giggling in remembrance at some of her brother's rantings. "Yes, Lazarus hasn't quite gotten over his judgment in this area." "But I really like Lazarus," Emilia said. "He's so funny. I loved it when he called the Messianic writings hallucinatory fantasies." Emilia paused and furrowed her brow, then raised her eyebrows to Martha. "What was the official word Yeshua used?" "Pseudepigraphia," Martha replied, making sure to pronounce the word slowly and clearly. Emilia put on an amusing blank expression. "I'll have to work on that word. But back to the timeline. Everybody fought everybody for another century after the Maccabees, and then the Romans came in and took over." Zephyrus lowered himself into a cross-legged pose on the ground. The arrival of the Romans was interpreted as another punishment from their God. In the eyes of these people, I am part of the rod that strikes them for their alleged unrighteousness. And so the fanaticism has grown out of all proportion. Every small-minded group fancies itself as the elect of Zion, the ones who will earn deliverance from the Romans and all other repressors, now and forevermore. "Lazarus is right," said Emilia. "This is really stupid. They constantly argue about who's holier than someone else." "That's exactly right, Emilia," Zephyrus agreed. "It's a contest of righteousness." "A contest nobody can win," muttered Hotep. He turned inquisitively to Martha. "Now I'm going to support Emilia and try to grasp the timeline. Lazarus rants and raves about the phony timeline of the supposed prophecy from the spurious Book of Daniel." "It's better if you never mention the Book of Daniel to Lazarus," Martha counseled, "unless you would like to spend the next hour listening to one of his heated lectures." Emilia rose to her knees. "Can I put the Daniel phenomenon into the timeline? I think I can do it." "Really?" asked Hotep. "You seem to be thinking ahead of me on this topic." "It's not a contest, Hotep," Emilia teased. "Now this is according to what we've heard from Lazarus, Martha, Mary, and Yeshua, so it's on good authority." Martha moved forward on her hands and knees and crawled a few feet to kiss Emilia. Martha returned to her cross-legged position and grinned with something akin to mischief, or at least as close as Martha could approximate the attitude. "You forgot Nicodemus and Joanna, but go ahead." Emilia sank back into sitting cross-legged and straightened her back. The Daniel story was written at the time of the Maccabees and their rebellion, but the author pretended it was written more than 400 years earlier, when the Babylonian conquest happened. He probably did that to fool people into thinking the story was valid prophecy. Emilia suddenly appeared puzzled. "But I got lost when Lazarus was talking about the 70 weeks of years, supposedly predicting when the final times would begin. And of course, people believe we're in those times now, added Zephyrus. And they avidly examine every minor occurrence for signs of the times. And so much of this obsession is based on a mere interpretation of something nebulous in a delusional book. Wasn't Lazarus funny? Asked Amelia. I laughed so hard when he went on and on about all the different ways people have interpreted the thing about the 70 weeks. Martha rolled her eyes. I might have enjoyed it more if I hadn't already heard it 100 times, but I have to give Lazarus credit. This time, he added a new way to calculate the timeline. Even though it's not a real timeline, said Hotep. But it's real to most of the Hebrew people, Zephyrus emphasized, with the result that here we have a nation in the grips of a mass delirium, believing their God is ready to send a Savior to remove Roman rule. He looked intently into Martha's eyes. Since Pontius and I are so concerned about the radicals, like Hezriel, help me understand this. Hezriel and his ilk seem to be expecting some sort of warrior messiah to lead a military overthrow. But I've been told no such thing is predicted in the writings. You've heard correctly, Martha assured him. People who study the writings view the Messiah as a man of peace. In fact, those truly versed in the Scriptures anticipate 2 messiahs, one priestly and one kingly. You would be more concerned with the kingly Messiah, but genuine scholars envision him as a man of peace. Zephyrus frowned. But those peaceful Hebrews don't constitute the majority of your population. Maintaining her eye contact with Zephyrus, Martha sighed. Not even close. Most of the people could easily be swept away into an armed revolution by the likes of Hezriel. And consider the way the common people are taxed. The populace is being drained by the priests and the Romans. If the average man sees an opportunity to throw off the yoke of oppression in the name of a Messiah, why would such a man care about the intricacies of spiritual interpretation? An uneasy silence fell. Zephyrus closed his eyes and bowed his head, feeling an internal pressure that made it hard to breathe. And this is only the first of 10 years, Pontius, and I will try to maintain the Pax Romana in this province. And something tells me Yeshua may stand forth as the most important ally that we have. You're not the only one who sees him in such a light, Martha said softly. Zephyrus raised his eyes to meet Martha's. Yeshua is beyond anything we've ever imagined. Not that I need to convince you, Martha. You know more about him than the rest of us combined. I want you to help me learn more than history, language, and customs. You, above all, can help me learn about the most important man of our age. It feels like everything will hinge on Yeshua, and yet he says, I am the one who will guide him through his darkest hour. My desire for pertinent knowledge is growing into desperation. Martha carefully articulated her response in a quiet but passionate voice. Believe what Yeshua says. He seems far more than any of us. But remember, he's not from our world. It's been thousands upon thousands of years, literally eons, since Yeshua lived in a world half as troubled as our own. He sees things we can't. But often, he can't comprehend what he sees because of the darkness. If Yeshua lacks anything, it's the ability to identify with malice and greed. That's why he wants me to guide him through the crucial times? Asked Zephyrus. Because I know how to navigate the darkness? Exactly, Zeph, answered Martha, with an even deeper passion. She gazed into his eyes, then Hotep's, then Emilia's, and then brought her full focus back to Zephyrus. I will share this much with you now, in front of our trusted friends. Yeshua told me that between lives, you volunteered for this mission. He selected you not only because you can walk back and forth between the light and the dark, but you can walk in both at the same time, and still know which is which. You can consciously walk in the dark while serving the light. That's quite a trick, Hotep murmured. And we're all here to help you, Zeph, Emilia reassured him. Yeshua made it clear. We all have our parts to play. And with that, I will end this reading for today. It is the end of the chapter, and I hope you're enjoying it, because I sure am. Well, I thank y'all for listening, and I'll see y'all later. Bye now.